Nullarbor Plain Cliffs are amazing. I can now take visiting them off my bucket list. The journey in the Tesla Model Y through the Australian outback to get me there has been straightforward. Hi, I'm John. In this video, I'll show you some of the highlights of travelling from Sydney to Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. We'll look at the charging stops to get me to the Nullarbor and on to Kalgoorlie, as well as some of the highlights. On day one, we travelled Sydney to Cobar in the state of New South Wales. We left Sydney early and travelled using the Tesla supercharging network at Bathurst and then also at Dubbo. All very routine. Dubbo feels like the start of the outback. How do I know this? Because I see there are a lot of Land Cruisers with farmers' hats on the dash. Also, the dirt starts to turn red. We continued on to charging at Nyngan at an NRMA 75 kilowatt DC charger and then stopped for the night at Cobar. While we had dinner, we charged at the NRMA 75 kilowatt DC charger. This charger and the one at Nyngan by NRMA are free. Next day we travelled from Cobar in New South Wales to Peterborough in South Australia. We headed to Wilcannia, with this drive being 260 kilometres. We charged at Wilcannia at a 75 kilowatt NRMA charger. From there, we headed to Broken Hill for lunch and charged at the NRMA 50 kilowatt DC charger there. This was to be the last DC fast charger that we would see for 1,900 kilometres. Our next leg down to Peterborough was our longest planned leg of the trip at 282 kilometres. So we charged at Broken Hill to 100%. We crossed over the border to South Australia and arrived at Peterborough with 9% charge remaining. We camped overnight in a caravan park and charged on a powered site using the 15 amp socket used for caravans. This added 52% overnight, which was enough for us to get to Port Augusta the next day. On day 3, we travelled from Peterborough to Wandina. We packed the camp up and headed off early. There were great things to see on the drive to Port Augusta, and we were surprised at the number of wind farms we saw. We stopped to charge at Port Augusta at a RAA 7 kilowatt charger. We had to use our Type 2 to Type 2 cable. We ended up staying here for 6 hours, had breakfast, did a bit of shopping and some sightseeing. Next we drove to Kimber, including a stop at the Iron Knob mining site to take a look. We arrived in Kimber at a brand new RAA 7 kilowatt charger. In fact, I was the first entry and plug share for this particular charging site. Also, a council vehicle came by and took some photos to put on their website to inaugurate the charger. Kimber is the halfway point across Australia, and they also have the largest galah. The last drive of the day saw us arriving at the Wandina Motel and Caravan Park. We plugged the Tesla into a 15 amp powered site and checked into the motel. The next day we travelled from Wandina to the start of the Nullarbor. First stop was at the Ceduna East-West Motel. They had a great setup here with a couple of Tesla destination chargers. We plugged in and walked around the town, had lunch and did some sightseeing. We spent 5.5 hours at Ceduna and left with 99% charge. We entered the Nullarbor Plain and the trees disappeared to flatness. We arrived at the Nullarbor Roadhouse and plugged into the 3-phase socket. The wind was up to 25-35 kilometres an hour, so we checked into a hotel room rather than set up the swag. This roadhouse is a busy place. The next day we travelled across the Nullarbor to Cockabiddy. We headed to the Nullarbor Plain Cliffs with 100% charge. To get to some of the viewpoints required travelling on some rocky dirt roads, which wasn't a problem for the Tesla Y. It was blowing a gale at the bike cliffs, so unfortunately camping was out of the question. We pressed on. We crossed the Western Australian border, stopping at a Mundrabilly Roadhouse We plugged into the three-phased and charged for an hour and a half while we had lunch. Next stop was the Madura Pass Roadhouse. We plugged into a 22 kilowatt CCS2 DC charger. So welcoming to get onto a DC charger. We continued on to Kalgoorlie and plugged into a three-phase next to a cage with some bald eagles in it. We camped overnight and watched the sunset. We awoke the next morning to a beautiful sunrise. With 100% charge, we were ready to tackle the longest straight road in Australia at 146 kilometres. Arriving in Balladonia, we plugged into a 22 kilowatt DC charger running off three-phase, enough to get us to Norseman. Quite an interesting setup, as this three-phase AC power was converted to DC for a faster charge. Arriving in Norseman, we attended the local Shire Council and paid a $37 fee to use the three-phase on the local oval. We plugged in and walked the town and had lunch. Last drive of the day was to Kalgoorlie. There were severe weather warnings of high wind. Fortunately, the Tesla navigation had made allowances for this when we were back at Norseman charging, and we made sure that we had enough margin to tackle the headwinds. The weather closed in and we were battered with wind and rain. We arrived in Kalgoorlie with 12% charge. Conveniently, there was a three-phase on the street in the centre of town to plug in overnight, while we stayed in a hotel on the main street. So part one of this trip saw us drive Sydney to Kalgoorlie, total distance of 3,400 kilometres. The average power consumption was 179 watt-hours per kilometre. Cost of electricity was $282. Roughly that equates to about a quarter of the cost of fuel had the trip been done in a normal ICE car. Part two of the trip sees us going anti-clockwise around the bottom part of Western Australia. We'll be visiting Perth, Busselton, Albany and Esperance. Join me on the next video.